So I'm going to talk about a couple of class things here at the beginning, and then at the very end, anybody that has questions, well, that's why I'll stay on as long as I need to for those questions. Uh, a couple of things that are coming up just in terms of the class, like I'll talk about the final. Um, the final will open up next Friday. It'll be like the time frame will be just like the midterm, so it'll open up next Friday and be open through next Wednesday, the 17th. So it'll be open from the 12th through the 17th. Excuse me. And the final is the same format, same amount of questions as a midterm. So 75 questions, multiple choice. There are a few questions, like 6 or 7 questions on the study guide that need to be edited for like probably some of the statistics or percentages might be off. It's not going to affect the exam. I just didn't use those particular questions on the exam. And so, and there's probably some questions on the study guide that have answers but no question, or questions and no answers. When I was going through editing, I think I just cut some things off. And so I re-edit those questions every couple of classes or every 2 or 3 classes. So if you have trouble finding an answer to a question, or the text says like a specific answer that's not listed on the study guide, that question won't be on the exam, so you can just skip it. So that's for the final. The other thing is for the paper. I've had some questions about the paper that I thought I talked about at the very, very beginning, but maybe I didn't. Just in terms of like topics. The topic is really kind of your choice. You're just looking at different developmental stages as kind of your overarching, like if you want to write about adulthood, but you're going to write about like a disorder or something that happens in adulthood, or a disorder or something that happens in adolescence. That's where your research piece comes in, and that's where you're going to cite, your whatever sources you're using. The 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 last part of the paper is just the reflection part, and that's where you're kind of like, hey, why not choose it, and what did I learn, and what do I think, and those are areas I'd like to research. There's questions that I gave you on the actual document to kind of go through, and so that paper is due on some people have already turned it in, which is great. I feel like that's due on the 13th maybe, but I can't remember. I could be wrong on the date. Maybe the 14th. All my dates for all my classes run together, so I'll tell you exactly when. If it'll open for me.
Moodle says the 13th.
Yeah, the 13th.
But it says 10:35 p.m.
Oh, that's just this. Don't worry about that.
Okay.
That's just because that's one more. I got to check like 6 boxes when I make something due, and I miss one of the boxes.
Gotcha.
Did y'all hear frustration about Moodle in my voice? Because that's what I meant for you to hear. So why would it say 10:35? Like, that's like a setting. That's a Moodle setting. Does that even make sense to anybody? You know what I'm saying? Like,
no,
why not like
no.
midnight or 5 p.m.? You know what I'm saying? Anyway, don't worry about that.
I do.
Yeah, don't worry about
After
the time.
After the pandemic started and we went back to regular school classes, we had to learn Canvas in like 2 weeks. And that was, I'm sure, similarly frustrating.
Yeah, Canvas sucks too.
Yeah, they all do.
Yeah, I use Canvas with my kids for a little while. We use Google now, Google Classroom now for everything. It's not great either, whatever. And Moodle's not horrible. Moodle's actually better than some other products for sure. But there's just parts of Moodle that I'm like, oh crap. Every time I think I've checked a box or done the right thing, something else is there that I didn't catch or something. So, okay. So those are the two big things that are left. Today we're going to talk about adulthood, and we're going to start with young adulthood and kind of pick up kind of where we left off last time in terms of age. And then we're going to hopefully work through until we're for sure going to get through middle adulthood today, which we're not going to get to some of the like some of the end of life discussions. We won't get to that. We won't get to that yet or at all. You will read about it. Some of that will be on the exam. But we will definitely get through middle adulthood. And what we'll do is we're going to spend our time talking through some of it will be lecture format, like just giving you some general information, but then some of it will be discussion oriented in terms of like working with whatever that age group is. Like we're going to have two specific breakout times. One will be focused on the kind of the young adult area, like 20 to 30-ish. And then the second breakout will be more of the middle adult, which is 35-ish to 60, around in there. So we'll have those two times, and there'll be some questions I'll ask for you guys to talk about. And then there'll be a little bit of lecture in between all of that. Okay. Having said that, let's get started. All right, let me move some stuff around so I don't have so much junk everywhere. There we go. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see this. So here's my attempt at humor at 11:30 in the morning. This is pretty accurate. Pretty much accurate to me. The energy one, that's debatable maybe. The energy one, having energy or not, a little bit debatable. One of the things that we talked about, and it was in the forum, forum discussions, like when does adulthood start? And there's been some pretty interesting discussions going on in the forum about that. It's interesting to think about in terms of like this transition from adolescence to adulthood. When does it actually happen? Do you guys have an opinion about that? What do you think? You go from adolescence to adult. Like what is that? How would we know? Like what's the marker? What's the transition marker there? What do you think?
I think it's different for each individual.
Okay. And tell me more about that.
So, like, depending on life circumstances, it could also be a cultural thing. So, I know, and I wrote this in my discussion post, depending on your culture. So, if you're Jewish or of Hispanic origin, then typically you have a bar, a bat mitzvah that helps define for them culturally that you're an adult. And then the quinceañera, but it also is revolved around the time period of where they reach sexual maturity per se physically. But a lot of people look at college and getting a full-time job or moving out and being fully financially independent and autonomous as the marker. But that being said, I've had plenty of friends in their mid to late 20s that live on their own, are financially independent from their parents and families, and still don't quite feel like an adult yet. So,
Okay. Gotcha. Anybody else?
I was in a class last session or last 10 weeks, whatever we call this. And we had a discussion about this because we were saying how maybe our grandparents married at like 18 or even younger, then that they got a job that they stayed in, or they stayed home and started raising babies, like everything, like that was the new stage of life. And people still might marry young like that, but now it's much more common to marry later. You know, we're exploring more of this young professionals time. And so it's like even the shift from adolescence to adulthood over time has also shifted.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. Anyone else?
I kind of think we should start thinking about it in terms of fully developed and connected frontal lobe, because we have, I know when I was 18 and when I was 25, I was two different people. And I was much more of an adult at 25 than I was at 18. So to me, that's something we should take into consideration, because I think our expectations need to shift up.
Shift up.
What at 18, we think that everybody's an adult. Now, as we say, it's all wide range, but our expectations of what they should be able to do and how they should be able to navigate the world we know is based on them not having a fully developed frontal lobe, which is that whole logical and reasoning part of the brain. So if we think about what we expect of 18-year-olds, really what we're talking about is what we should be expecting of 25-year-olds, and then work that backwards.
Okay.
I think freshmen in high school, the expectations of them are crazy compared to where they are developmentally.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's just something to shift.
Yeah. So some ways of thinking about it would be neurological in nature too, not just stage of life or cultural, which are those all obviously those are important. But
Yeah, I wouldn't want to ignore any of them, but I would also want to include that in the conversation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good.
And we also might want to consider culturally that the United States has such a strange idea of the nuclear family that was a lot more short-lived than some of us know.
Okay.
Right. So like in a lot of European cultures, the family stayed in the same house after the grandkids are born.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Which is definitely a cultural component for sure. Like if we live in a collective society versus an individualistic society kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Good.
You know, I know there's a biological perspective, and I agree with that. But I'm listening to, I agree with, I forget her name, but a person biologically might be ready, but based on the culture, are they ready? So those are, there's a perspective, well, biologically, this is when it happens. But then it's based on the culture also. Does that biologically, because they're ready, does that mean they're ready to make that transition culturally?
Yeah. I think the reason why we have discussions like this is because there's not a short answer. Whereas 150 years ago, the answer was fairly short. You know, you get a certain age, then there's an expectation of you, let's say. And some of that has changed. Some of it's changed because of time. One of the things we talked about last class is this idea of even of adolescence, you know, how it started coming about, at least in America. And now we have similar conversations now about like what's adulthood. And so, and I don't know who said this, Sarah, or I don't know who said this, but if we know people that would be like 20, 28 that live on their own, work, blah, 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 what else, but don't feel like they're adults, right? Like now we're also saying that there's some feeling that needs to happen, whether that's emotional or mental or both kind of thing. And I'm not arguing that that's wrong or anything, but there's multiple different perspectives to kind of look at. For our purposes, well, we're not going to answer all that today, but we know certain things happen developmentally. This is why I keep kind of coming back to development. The development process itself hasn't changed that much in 200-300 years in terms of just straight development, like biological development, cognitive development. Now there's been changes in our world, obviously environmental changes, there's been cultural changes, there's been things we know now that we didn't know before. That's all changed for sure, absolutely. But developmentally, like we still go through puberty. We still learn how to walk and crawl and run and talk and read. We still go through puberty. We still become sexually active. We still, there's things that happen to us. Our brain forms fully at around 25 or 26. That's probably been the case for a long, long time. It just hasn't mattered until recently as much, maybe potentially. So the developmental process itself hasn't changed a ton over time. Now, we have, for example, physically speaking, we have gotten taller as people over time, for example, like that's happened. We were talking about intelligence in the last class. It's called the Flynn effect. People have gotten more intelligent over time. We're talking about decade over decade over time. That's happened for sure. So there's always been some type of evolution of something happening, but the process itself hasn't changed as much as the environment we live in has changed pretty dramatically, starting with the Industrial Revolution all the way forward. Things have just changed, and now things are different now. Even like David mentioned, I've got a daughter that'll be a freshman in high school this year, and I've worked with freshmen in high school in 3 generations now. So I've worked with 3 generations of clients, and I would say that the development is the same, but the environment's different, and the stressors are different. So sometimes we also need to think about stress, like stressors of whatever, and stressors can be lots of things, right? So we can think about it that way. So, it depends on who you ask or who you talk to. Some people would say that, well, you're an adult when you can live on your own, have your own job, be independent financially. So there's like this heavy financial component. That would be a big key feature, right? What we also know is that from around, well, we kind of talked about this last time. When we start getting into the 18 to 25, 26, 27 range, there's vast differences in those ranges. Like a 25-year-old and an 18-year-old are very different, very, very different. Both genders, actually. Mainly, the biggest difference is the neurological differences that are occurring. For example, the way in which we will develop neurologically from the age 20 to 25 is pretty phenomenal, actually, the growth that happens. The only other time that we grow at that speed or at that rate is when we're young, like toddler or infant stage. So those things are really big. We talked about this idea of self when we're kids, little. We talked about identity development. Identity exploration is another piece of that, especially as we get into adulthood. You start to come in contact more specifically with work or career types of discussions. You come in contact maybe for the first time with like significant relationships. Not that you don't have significant relationships before, because you do, but they become more there's a little bit more weight on them typically as you get older. You feel sometimes, and this might go to kind of the feeling like, do I feel like an adult or not? There's this feeling of like feeling in between worlds, like in between the adult world and the adolescent world. You can actually feel kind of in between those worlds. And sometimes it feels like like maybe feeling lost or stuck, or not paralyzed as much, but like I've had sessions recently with some clients that were between 19 and 21, let's say, and some of them would say, I feel stuck or I feel lost because I see my friends doing XYZ over here, going to college, living away, blah, blah, blah. And I'm at home and I can't go to college yet. So I feel like there's this imbalance of something happening. And so that, sometimes you can feel a little bit of stuck. At the same time, this particular time frame, especially like the young adult time frame, in terms of possibilities, is pretty wide open. I mean, there's a lot of possibility that's there to come. Not that we don't have possibilities as we get older, but there's just a difference in the way we can actually really transform our lives. I mean, we can really, really kind of do that. We can kind of become whatever we want to become. Like you might hear, if you work with certain age groups, like especially late adolescence into young adulthood, they might say, going to college, I could recreate myself. That's that kind of thought, that mentality. I can become someone else. I can become someone new, not in a bad way, but just like recreate themselves, because you can't do that. So we've kind of talked about all of these, like taking responsibility and, the economic piece, being independent, having a job, those kinds of things. Those are all markers, but that doesn't answer the question per se, but they can all be markers of things. It doesn't mean that you might have some like right now, like I live in a smaller town than where we used to live. And so it used to be very rural. It's becoming less rural, but I grew up in a very rural area of Texas. And it was very common, and still is, for kids to graduate high school and become like plumbers or electricians or bricklayers or whatever. Or we had a lot of cattle, dairy farms and cattle farms and things like that, cattle ranches. So it was really pretty common for that to happen. And that movement's kind of coming back in a lot of rural areas in terms of like really nice tech programs in high schools that help kids become start their electrician journey or become plumbers, or even in the cosmetology areas. There's a lot of really good programs now that are helping kids do that. So it's basically like this skill building that's happening, which I think is very good. It's actually really helpful because not everyone will go to college. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But some people will, and that's fine too. So we also have programs in high schools now that I think are nice. Besides the AP and IP programs, just the dual credit classes where you can get credit in the high school and in college and start working on your education earlier while you're in high school, which I think can be super helpful as well. So we have a lot of advances that can be offered. And I think it's actually very good to offer kids those choices. Now, having said all that, if we talk about, I had a client from Australia not too long ago. And one of the things he brought up, this I didn't even think about, but I've had other friends that have talked about it too. In Australia, where he lived, and then I know in other parts of Europe, this is true. When they graduate high school, they take a whole gap year and they just travel. They go do whatever thing they're going to do, and it's just expected that you're going to do that. And if we talk that way in America, it's kind of like, well, what are you talking about? You're supposed to go to college right away. Well, there's no like rule about it. You don't have to. You can, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also nothing wrong with taking time to figure out what you want to do. So either one of those is okay, because it is a fairly big transition, and you're going to start going through a fairly big transition neurologically as you move from 18 to 25. It's a pretty big brain transition, for sure. Having said that, when we start thinking about this transition from high school to college to work, that in and of itself is also a large transition for people. And some people will move through those transitions just fine. My brother went from high school to college, had a major, did the major, got a job right out of college. And he worked in that job until about 2 months ago, where all he did was change companies in the same field. He's been in the technology field for however long. I was the exact opposite. I went to high school. I did as little work as humanly possible to get by because I hated school, but I liked playing baseball. And then graduated high school, tried going to college, failed out of college, in 2 junior colleges, failed out, and just worked full time for 3 years, and then decided maybe I should go back to school. So I was 22 when I went back to school. And now I have a PhD, which is totally crazy because I hated school at one point. Now I love it, right? 2 totally different paths. Same genetics, basically, same family, same expectations, all those things. My sister, same thing, high school, college, started working, eventually got married and as a stay-at-home mom and doesn't have any plan to go back to work. And she's cool with that, right? So the path that we take is sometimes we don't even know. To David's point, an 18-year-old graduating college, sometimes we don't even know what path they're going to take. You think they're going to go down one path, and maybe they go down another one. So there's mainly because there's so much that happens for us or that can happen for us in terms of transitions, in terms of how our brain is developing, in terms of our personality and how it's developing. So in all of those things to say that transition from adolescence to adulthood can be a little murky, can be a little unclear, and that's okay. Now, having said that, there are a large group of the population that do not like murky, do not like unclear, right? We want to know this, then this, then this. Sometimes that's not possible. So sometimes the anxiety that comes that you'll see clinically now will come from parents of kids that maybe don't go boom to boom to boom to boom to boom. And they're like kind of lost and their parents are like, something's wrong with them and something's happening. And well, it sounds like you're having trouble with the murkiness, which is totally understandable. I guarantee you my parents hated that I quit college and worked full time. I guarantee it. They never told me that. But if I went back and asked them now, they'd tell me. I know for a fact they hated it. My mom especially. I know they did. They were always like, oh my gosh. Because every once in a while they say, if you thought about going back to school, every once in a while they would say something. Because there's a murkiness to it that's very uncomfortable. And so some of this murkiness that happens will eventually clear up, for sure. I've actually seen it happen too much, and just kind of the research kind of talks about it. Some of this stuff I'm not going to worry about, like your physical, your physical health and thing. I mean, some of this I'm not going to worry about, but let's talk about drinking. Let's talk about substance abuse and alcohol. All right. So you're more likely to do binge drinking at certain ages. And one of those is that murkiness between adolescence and adulthood. Binge drinking is 5+ drinks at one time, at least once over 2 weeks, which is technically binge drinking. And you're more likely to do that, like kind of what we know from research is that behavior potentially could increase in college. Substance abuse itself, whether it's alcohol or other substances, is often self-medicating for maybe something like an underlying psychopathology or like an underlying something that's happening for them mentally. a lot of times, not 100%, but it's pretty high percentage. For the most part, even if that binge drinking occurs, like say in those college years or that time frame, for the most part, people will come out on the other side of that and not become alcoholics or not still binge drink or not get addicted to a substance. That it doesn't happen in the majority of people. The majority of people come out of that and kind of get on the other side of it, and then they don't really have an issue with it. But there is a little smaller percentage of folks that will continue the alcohol or the substance use after those years and will find themselves facing a real problem, a real disorder. And that can really have detrimental effects on several different areas of life: job, social, all your relationships. Compulsions typically will increase. Impulse control becomes more and more of an issue. You start alienating people. There's lots of things that can happen in that time frame. And so that's when it becomes a problem, is when those things start to happen and they keep happening over a long period of time. Having said that, I've worked with plenty of clients that definitely for sure binge drank in college, and then even after college kind of probably kept partying for a certain amount of time, and then eventually it kind of trailed off. But what happened was their anxiety maybe increased and they weren't drinking anymore, so they didn't know how to medicate or deal with the anxiety. So that's kind of what we worked on. And I've had dozens of folks like that. Okay. There's almost nothing more addictive than nicotine. Caffeine and nicotine meth is very addictive. Nicotine is extremely addictive. Methamphetamine's like one shot, like one usage addictive too. It's very addictive. Nicotine is very addictive and legal, and caffeine, same kind of addiction issue. The actual rates of smoking, I don't know if I have it in here. I don't think I do. The actual rates of cigarette smoking is going down, but like vaping is going up. So there's other things that are happening instead of like straight cigarette smoking. But I've worked in the addiction field where someone was trying to give up on one thing, but they also smoked, and we used to actually advise them, hey, don't try to give up this thing, whatever this is, alcohol or meth or heroin or whatever, and give up cigarettes. Don't try to do them both at the same time. It's probably too difficult. Let's do one at a time. And so the addiction to nicotine I've actually seen it help people quit other addictions before. Okay. There's a couple of things I want to talk about real specifically before. Yeah. I think when we start talking about careers and work, as we get into the early to mid 20s, then we're starting to talk about a couple of different things. You're gonna, obviously, whether you go the college route or not, typically you do typically try to find some kind of work, some way to make money, some way to find things you like doing. That's pretty typical, and that's going to happen. Only around 20% of 12 to 22-year-olds had a clear vision of where they want to go in life or have a clear purpose. That's pretty low. That's probably very accurate. And a lot of times it's because really we're only looking at the short term, not really the long term. That's actually changing a bit. There's a certain amount of folks now kind of looking long term. So a lot of times what's happening, like if we think about career and work, there is starting to be some niche opportunities in the arena of like career counseling. So a lot of you guys that are going through this program, you could find yourself working in that field of career counseling. It's actually a very active field right now. Not just helping adolescents kind of figure out what the direction they want to do, but also like working adults that kind of maybe want to change careers or shift gears in some way, or maybe go back to school or find a different job or that kind of thing. There's actually a pretty good niche for that right now, I think, that you can kind of help people with. And there's lots of reasons why people shift gears and change. Um, it's also common to change careers between 2 and 4 times over the history of your kind of work life. That's also common. That happens. That used to not be the case, but it is now. But that actually has been that way for probably 30 years, probably 20 years. It's been that way. There's a lot of assessment types of things you can use with folks that are going that direction. I think one of the things that I have seen over the past 2 years, especially, is what I think is the impact of COVID has having on stress at work, in lots of different fields. I think COVID has added some stressors to people's lives that probably just no one was going to think about. But I've probably got, I don't know, 90% of my clients talk about work stress now, like almost every session, in different like different kinds of stress, besides just like a life stress or things that are happening in their personal life. So that's starting to become more and more a consideration. And I actually have been reading a little bit more about how certain companies are starting to address that in how they kind of are trying to offer like mental health support for a lot of their employees now. That's actually happening a lot more, which I think is good. That's a really good thing. So anyway, the impact of stress can really be difficult for people, especially depending on your job. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Some of this stuff I'll just let you read. All right, let's take a step back. All right, I talked for a lot here. I didn't mean to talk that long. Any questions about any of these things before we jump to the next thing? Any questions?
Those slides are on Moodle.
They will be.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Here's what I want to do. And this is something I do with my clients. Especially in the areas of career, work, those kinds of things. And since we kind of are talking about it, it's super common to start choosing career paths and work paths at this age. What I want to do is break us into groups. And this will be, hopefully it's a little fun too. I want you guys to just talk about a couple of things. The first thing is, how did you decide like your career, whether that's something you're doing now or something you're going to do, whether that was something right out of high school you thought or not? How did you decide on the career path because we got a lot of folks in here that have had different careers. And that's great. That's actually really helpful. So how did you decide on your career path? That's the first thing. And the second thing would be like, okay, how would we help someone else figure that out? Like what things do we need to think about to help someone else figure that out? So the first one is, how'd you decide your path? What does that look like? And the second one is, how would you help someone else figure that out? All right, I'm gonna let y'all talk about that for about 7 or 8 minutes. Let's do, oh man, we got perfect 3 in a room. That's awesome. Love it when it's even. Or I love it when we can do it equally. I didn't get any of that recorded. Oh well. Sorry if you're listening to the recording, you just missed a really good discussion. So you'll have to ask someone about it. Okay. When we talk about relationships, attraction, love, close relationships, yes, women and men do these differently. Absolutely. There are different parts of the brain that will light up with men versus women. If it's visual, if it's like if there's verbal interaction, that's absolutely true. At the same time, there are some things that are universally fairly accurate across gender in terms of like how our neurobiology happens, like oxytocin, which is kind of that love, feel good neurotransmitter, happens for both people. And that usually happens within that and stays happening within that first 6 months of meeting someone. And after about 6 months, it tends to start going down and kind of level off. It doesn't go all the way out, just kind of levels off. You can do things to make it increase again, which are really good, but it tends to level off. And so you're left with potentially different, maybe a different feeling than the first feelings that you had about someone. Anyone that's met someone and thought, man, this person's great, and then 6 months in, you're like, I don't know anymore. That's kind of part of that feeling. That's part of what happens. There's these different types of love, and one of the best ways to view it is kind of with, that's why I like this, because I'm visual anyway. So seeing a graphic like this, intimate, commitment, passion. So infatuation, high passion, and passion is, I don't know if I didn't put that in there. Passion is exactly what it sounds like. Very highly sexual, highly lustful, highly physical. There's a high level of that when we talk about passion, and that's infatuation. Where there's very low intimacy, in other words, sharing of dreams and being vulnerable necessarily, like emotionally especially, and very low commitment, right? Affectionate love is where you don't have a ton of passion, but you got really a lot of intimacy, like you share things with each other, you emotionally become vulnerable over time, and you start to become more committed with someone, and you have less passion but more intimacy and commitment, where you have affectionate love. And that's sometimes what happens in like a friendship, like a new friendship with someone that may or may not end up being a romantic partner. That happens. Infatuation or a fatuous love is where you have a lot of passion and you're really committed, but not a lot of vulnerability and a lot of intimacy, not a lot of like transparency emotionally. So you have this kind of passion and the commitment, and you stay together, but you don't have a lot of connection pieces and a lot of connection points. And then consummate love is kind of when you put all three together, you have consummate love. And it's also not uncommon for any relationship to go through stages or levels of each of these throughout the time of their relationship. That's going to happen too. Obviously, what we're kind of looking for is more that consummate love. That's kind of the sweet spot. A lot of times you can see, like with couples, for example, if you work with couples that have been married a certain amount of time, and maybe they come to you and like I see this a lot with folks maybe going through kind of empty nest periods, or kind of towards the empty nest period, where the kids are about to be out and they're starting to think like, I'm going to be with this person I married that I used to love a lot, and now I'm going to be with them all the time, and there's no buffer. And kind of now what is going to happen? And you still have commitment, you're still committed, you're not trying to get divorced or anything, but there's not really a lot of passion, and maybe there's a little intimacy but not very much. And so whenever you, I kind of actually visualize this a lot of times, this graphic in my head when I'm talking to people. And then I try to start helping them kind of rediscover whichever area that maybe they need to help rediscovery. Like for example, if someone comes in and either one or both of them says, you know, I don't think this is like a commitment issue. There's no infidelity. We trust each other. We're committed to each other. We actually get along. We actually see a lot of things very similarly. We parent together very well, but we just don't. We have no, like a lot of the way you'll hear it is we don't have a lot of connection. What I hear is we maybe lost some passion, but we probably also lost some intimacy. We've lost some vulnerability. We've lost the ability to talk with each other at more than just a surface level. There could be tons of reasons why that's happening. But this, as we think about young adulthood into adulthood, this particular type of thought, like thinking about like how love works, because adult love is different than adolescent love. How adult love looks and adult commitment and adult attachment works is different. It looks different, feels different, it works differently. And so these are some of the things that that when we start talking about transitions into, especially as we start getting into like early into middle adulthood, because, and I think Sarah said this or someone said this earlier, the average age of, like if we talk about marriage in general, the average age of marriage is getting older, and the average age of having children is getting older too. Both those things are growing. And so whereas you used to have folks maybe get married in their early 20s, now it's their late 20s. Some of these areas of love they might have a better understanding of and better grasp of because of time and experience, which is good. So that's not a bad thing. But this is definitely something I have found really helpful for me in my practice, just kind of looking at this and kind of pushing, like looking at how it works. And I find it to be, well, this is, first of all, this is highly researched, but also I find this to be very practical, just kind of a practical way. I want to look at kind of talked about this marital trend idea. Actually, marriage rates are going down too. I don't want to get into a lot of that yet. There's big transitions, like even in adulthood, most as you're getting older and become a parent, there's a lot of things that happen too in those transitions. I'm gonna jump out of this. I might come back to some of these, but I want to. There's a couple of things I really want to share. I don't want to miss. I can't remember if it's this one or this one. I just think this is just actually funny to me. My kids don't think it's funny, but I do. This is like legit true. Like how you load your dishwasher is definitely like Tetris. Like I actually do make it a game. That's kind of weird, I think. I want to talk a little bit about I don't want to just hang out in young adulthood. I want to transition into the middle adulthood area. And so for the most part, 40s into the 60s is what we're talking about for the most part. So if we think young adulthood, really 20s into late 30s is kind of that area. And then middle adulthood is that kind of 40s into 60s is that gap of time that we're talking about for the most part. There's some declines that start happening for sure, but there's also some stabilization that happens as well. Some of the declines are cognitive, some of them are physical, but some of the more stable things are like kind of like we were talking career-wise. A lot of times it's a lot more stable. Financially, you're most of the times a lot more stable. One of the things that also starts to happen as you move along through middle adulthood is meaning, like meaning in your life, and legacy starts to become more and more important. Maybe not as much in your early 40s, but like if you get into your late 50s and 60s, that becomes more important for you. And so one of the things that'll be interesting to see as we move forward in our world is as the age of having your first child grows, like that age gets older, it'll be interesting to see how some of these things change. For example, we tried for 6 years to have kids and had a lot of trouble. And then my son was born when I was 35. So I turned 50 this year. He's 15. So we're like old parents in my son's group, basically. A lot of them had kids, in their late 20s. And so that's becoming more common. That'll become more common. And so he'll be 25 and I'll be 60, which is kind of weird because I think, and my mom was like, when I was 60, I already had blah, blah, blah. My mom already had blah, blah, blah. Well, it's a totally different world now. We don't live in a world where, I think my grandmother I think by the time she was 25, she already had 5 kids, I think. Well, that's just not happening as much anymore. It's different now. So that means your grandparents, you might be older as grandparents potentially. So those things are happening. So I'll just be interested to see kind of how some of these things happen. There is a difference between how you identify in terms of age versus what your chronological age is. So in other words, how you identify like age-wise, like I'm 50, but I don't really identify as 50 in my mind. I don't think about it that way. Sometimes I do when I get up and something hurts that never hurt before. I'll think about it that way, but sometimes I don't. And same for if you're in your 30s, you might feel that way too. So how we identify in terms of age versus our chronological or biological age could be a little different. You could feel things differently and go through things differently. And a lot of that's physical, but some of that could be cognitive as well. Man, there's something on here. I think it's this. Sorry, guys. I think it's this one. I think it's on here. One of the things that, well, I get questions about it, so I just started talking about it in general, is midlife crisis. A lot of people want to talk about it. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to break into our groups, and this is only going to be about a 5-minute discussion. So it's not going to be super long, but this is going to be super straightforward. The only question that you're going to talk about is, do you believe in midlife crisis? Is it a thing? Do you actually believe that it is or not? And why? So that's what you're going to talk about, and then we'll come back. All right.
Okay, we needed more time for that discussion.
Nah, you're good. You don't need more time. All right. What made you want more time?
Well, in my room, it was interesting because of the 3 of us, I'm the only one that's actually been through midlife. So I had some personal experience to speak from.
Yeah.
But then they also had experience with, where they are in relation to midlife or where their parents are. And so just having that dynamic to be able to speak to all of those positions and those perspectives was pretty interesting.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Does anyone, I don't know. What'd y'all talk about? Let me ask it that way.
We talked about what you told us to talk about.
Well, I know that. I want to know what you said. That sounds like my kids.
Well, in our group, one of the things that we talked about was that we felt like the pandemic probably heightened some of these feelings in people, and prompted a lot of people to make some changes that they may not have otherwise made had the pandemic not provided the opportunities.
Okay.
And another, leave the house. Empty nesting might bring about thoughts about changing your life situation.
Yeah, sure. Good. Is anyone like, I know for a fact, for sure, if there's a midlife crisis, anybody's like, this is for sure.
I did. I feel like it. I feel like people go through it, but their midlife may happen at different points. So, as an example, I didn't become a mother until I was almost 40.
Mhm.
So my midlife is happening now,
Mhm.
15 years, into parenthood, when a lot of other people might experience it in their 40s because they had their kids earlier.
You can't afford to have it now.
Exactly. I'm putting myself through college and a kid and looking at retirement at the same time.
That's right. Hey, I'm right there with you. Yeah. I like talking about things like this because this is the kind of stuff your clients will talk about. This is like legitimate. I know this sounds weird, but this is like legit things that will come up. Things like this, like the midlife crisis, culturally speaking, has whoever is in charge of marketing a midlife crisis has done a great job of marketing anything that happens that's out of the norm as a midlife crisis. So it might not be that, it could be something else. For example, I hit the wrong button there. One of the things that's probably happening in midlife, especially in the 40s, is what started in childhood and adolescence and carries into young adulthood starts to end in midlife, in that you're starting to assess and think about all the truths and experiences and things you learned. And then you're like, okay, I like that, or I don't like that, or I keep that, or I don't want to keep that, or this value is really my value, or this one's not. That's actually happening a lot, that kind of thing. There's actually a very small minority of folks that actually would qualify for a midlife crisis type of thing to happen. At the same time, we do have things that happen to us in midlife that aren't happening to us in other stages of life as well. Job changes, kids, relationships, moving. Not that you can't do any of those things later, but like when you're an older adult, you're probably not having kids, you're probably not changing jobs a ton. You might not even be. I don't plan on moving. I told my family this is it. I'm not moving again, ever again, which is totally stupid because we're probably going to move again. But you just have things that happen in those 40s to 60s that don't happen at other times. And how you respond to it is important. And so what we're a lot of times helping folks do is respond to whatever is going on for them. For example, I'm going to pick on Rhonda for a second because I can pick on myself too. It would be very common for a client, maybe like Rhonda, to come in and say, I should have been here by now, but I'm here, right? Because we have an expectation that we should have done this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and I'm doing it out of order. I'm not doing that. Like I went back to school at 37 or 36. That's a little bit out of order. I should have done that. If I wish I'd have done it at 25, right? Sometimes that kind of thing discombobulates people, and you have to help them kind of figure that out and work through that kind of stuff. So when we talk about there was one more thing that related to that. That's all personality stuff. This kind of goes along with what I was saying. When we start getting into middle age or middle adulthood, we for sure start to interpret, shape, alter, and give meaning to life. We give meaning to our life. Not that we can't do it earlier, because we do. I think we're always making meaning in some way. But when we get into that midlife or middle adulthood, we do start giving meaning to a lot of things, or shaping things, or interpreting things differently, or altering things. I think one of the things that is important to practice personally and to think through clinically is how cognitively we can be, like how cognitive, like how flexible we are cognitively. How flexible, now I'm not saying breakable, I'm saying how much can we flex our beliefs, how much can we flex our thoughts, really? How much can we flex like the things that we once thought were always the same? Maybe there's some changes that need to happen in the way we think about things. How flexible can we be? The reason why I say it this way is because most typically, we're not going to talk about this today, but as you get into older adulthood, which is that, mid 60s through into the 80s and beyond, the ability to be flexible cognitively is harder and harder to do. And if we're able to try to stay cognitively flexible, it actually does impact our life, our experience, that kind of thing. And so I think as we start thinking through like working with adults, you might come across certain adult populations that just are very inflexible with their thought process. If someone's inflexible with their thought process, but they want to come to you for help with change, that's kind of hard to do. Like someone's got to want to change, or change a thought process, or change the way that they're thinking. Not just necessarily like positive and negative, not just that, just maybe how they're doing it. Including the information that they're taking in and how they synthesize that information or not, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of those a lot of the ways that we think really start to definitely solidify as we get from the 30s to the 40s to the 50s. A lot of those things really start to solidify. I'm going to put all of these slides up. Man, there's so many things. I'm going to run out of time. I knew I was going to.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop here. I'm going to go down all these rabbit trails. I'll never land the plane. Okay. You guys have any questions about, let's talk just real briefly about the content of stuff we were talking about today. And I realize I've jumped around a lot because it's a very broad time frame we're talking about. Any questions about any things that we talked about today?
I have a question about the ability to be cognitively flexible.
Yep.
Can you work on that? Is that something you can change, or is it something that
Yes.
once you've solidified, you can't go back from it?
You can. Yeah, you can. Now, depending on the deep, like if it's let's say it's a deep held value or belief, then it might get harder for sure. But cognitively, if you want to start thinking a little differently, you definitely can. You can for sure restructure like positive and like negative thought patterns, for sure. That you can do. We know that for sure. And you actually can do that well into your 70s, maybe even 80s. You can do that for sure. Absolutely. I think what I think what happens is the kind of want to, I call it the want to button. That want to button doesn't get pushed on as easily, right? Like sometimes we like what we know and that's it. And there's nothing wrong with that either. I'm just saying, when we work with people that come into us and they're saying, I want to change XYZ, how do we change XYZ? We do it cognitively first, for the most part. So does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I
So
had a
yes, you
question.
can.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a point when you mentioned a person has, they have to want to change? Is there a point when you determine, well, this person really doesn't want it? I mean, how do you continue something that's not really going to work? Because they have to make it work. They have to want it.
Yeah. Most of the time that'll take care of itself, because they won't be getting what they think they want or something,
Okay.
something like that. So I'm fairly direct about it. I'm like, I'm not sure if this is working. What do you think?
Okay.
That's what I do. I just ask, like, hey, are we doing the things that are helpful for you or not? Or, and I learned this technique from, golly, an old supervisor a long time ago. And I don't know why it works, but it works. There's a visualizing thing. When you have like two competing thoughts like that, like someone comes in saying, I want to change or develop or grow or whatever, but they don't really want to change their thinking patterns, right? I usually will say, on one hand, and I'll do that, on one hand this, but on the other hand this. And that visual is for some, and I even do that virtually with people. For some reason, that like they can see that sitting there side by side, and then they go, oh yeah. And then they have a decision to make, and it's right in front of them, right? There's like a decision. Do I really want to change this or not? Because that's not my job to like make them change as much as help them change. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's just something you kind of figure out as you go too sometimes.
Okay.
For sure. If I was you, here's what question I would ask. If I was a student, what about if you're working with someone and they want someone else to change and they tell you how that other person should change? Does that happen, and what do you do? That's a question I would ask. But nobody's asked it, so I don't have to talk about it.
You gotta talk about what you can control. I can't control anybody else but me.
That's it.
Now I don't look at how am I gonna change how I'm perceiving or accepting what's coming from that person
That's it.
in order to make myself feel happy. That's all I can control. I tell it to kids all the time.
Yeah. And I don't want to control somebody else. I've got enough trouble controlling myself. Yeah. Any other questions about anything we're talking about?
If I'm dealing with someone and that does happen, it's always about someone else. What I try to do is go put it right back on them without being judgmental. I try to flip it on them, and see like that. But sometimes that doesn't work for some reason. It's a struggle trying to get people to focus on themselves, especially when dealing with relationships. So it's about what the other person is doing. Like they're my problem.
Yeah, I think self-responsibility is very important for sure. Like helping someone be responsible for themselves is really important and easy not to do too, which is kind of difficult, but you can again point that out. All right. Now, any questions about anything else? And I'll stay. And if anyone wants to jump off and you're done, that's awesome. You can go. Anybody wants to stay, I'll stay on until the last person standing. So anyone that has questions about anything, that's why I wanted to stay on a little bit longer. Bye, David.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Dr.
Hi.
Bedard.
Hi.
I'll stay for you.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yeah, just
I'll
turn your
wait.
just turn your volume down. That's why it's feedbacking.
Okay. May I go?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so is there a, forgive me, I have a lot going on in my world. So if you already have this up, I'm gonna ask for your forgiveness. But do we have a study guide as we did for the midterm for the final?
We do.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes?
Yep.
Okay, okay, all right, okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And we only have the final and the paper.
That's right.
Okay, and if I have a question this week, what is the easiest way to get in contact with you? Because I would email you, but apparently there's a specific way to email you that I was not aware of. So what is the best way to get in contact with you?
I would just, let me give you this. Try do this one. And I was talking about this in my last class. I got some emails from people that I replied to and then they came back to me. So I'm not sure why, but that email I just put in the chat is a good way to get a hold of me.
Okay, I got it. Okay,
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Can I just ask? I don't know why I'm getting echo though.
Yeah, I think your volume's turned up. Or if you want to just put it in the chat, like type it in the chat, that'd be fine too. I'm not going anywhere.
For our paper, is it essentially a literature review?
No, not necessarily. I mean, you're definitely researching one particular topic, and there's going to be literature involved in it for sure. But the actual research part is about the actual topic, mainly the disorder or whatever you're looking at, right? So, I don't think it's bad to write it in a way of here's what the study says, or like that's okay to write it from that standpoint. Yeah. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And then I just ask you about my topic. Should I email you that, or does it not matter?
If you want to ask now, you can, or if you can email it, doesn't matter to me.
Would doing like what was my topic? Would doing how like self-soothing influences development and personality, would that be too narrow of a topic, or would that kind of be in the area?
Like you're talking about like mindfulness kinds of stuff?
Yeah, so like how self-soothing impacts like whether a person is more has like their attachment level going on, or would
That'd be a lot of work, but you could do it. Versus like mindfulness techniques in adolescence or mindfulness techniques with anxiety in adulthood or something like that. That's maybe maybe a little more narrow focus potentially.
okay.
The attachment part, I don't know a lot of like mindfulness or self-soothing work with attachment. There probably it's out there, but I just don't know a lot of I don't know a lot about that.
Okay,
That'd be interesting. I'm sure there's got to be something at this point.
I'll try and take a look, and if I can't, then I'll look more into the mindfulness side. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, at the assignment, I'm assuming you mean the paper, the difference between the review and what I learned. So basically, a couple of people have asked about this. So when you're going through the paper, I'm just asking you to give like the basics of whatever the developmental stage you're looking at. And then when you write down the things that you've learned, I'm just taking for granted that you learned something, hopefully, in that stage, whatever that stage is. And you're just going to write those things down. Like, for example, if I was writing about adulthood and my paper was developmentally was going to be on early adulthood, and let's say I didn't know until I took this class that the prefrontal cortex wasn't fully developed until age 25. Well, that's not my idea. I learned that from either the book or another source, and that's what I'm putting down that I learned. That part of the paper might not be super long, or it might be really long. I don't know. I have no idea. Does that hopefully answer the question? Maybe? Yeah, okay. Good. All right.
Okay, well, I have a question about topic, because I've got a couple of topics that I've been bouncing around, and now I'm afraid that they may be too specific.
Yeah.
And one is related to adolescence and kind of the emergence of gender identity.
Mhm. Yep.
You know, specifically since there seem to be so many options that were available when we were kids. We were either boys or girls, and
Yep.
today that's really kind of not the way things happen.
Yep.
And then the other is ADHD in adults.
Yep.
Would either of those topics
either one of
be-
those, yeah, either one of those would be great.
Okay.
And you would find plenty of information on either one of those.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Anybody else?
And you said those statistical based questions on the study guide are not going to be on the final.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The ones that don't match up with the book, they won't be on the final.
Okay.
I'm actually in the process of redoing that whole study guide.
Well, hopefully what I sent you will help.
Yeah, it does. That helps me a lot. I like it when you guys send me stuff like that. That helps me because sometimes I don't catch everything sometimes.